It's an absolute pleasure and a delight to be invited to come and talk to you, to raise awareness of water voles and beavers and some of the work that we're doing in London, which I'm sure will be very applicable and appropriate to your setting. In fact, I'm just in the conversations prior to starting this call, Robert told me that just on the Marden Valley, you've recorded some water voles just this morning, which is absolutely cracking. So hopefully this will be very relevant to you, well, to some extent at least. So before I begin, I'll just quickly tell you what Citizen Zoo is. It's a very strange sort of name. It always raises an eyebrow because people get rather confused about what it is. We chose the name just because it was quite memorable really. And but the ethos around the organisation is all about community-led conservation. So very much the work that you're doing in the Bristol area is very much aligned to the work that we're doing, I'm sure. But it's a relatively new organisation, and we have sort of two main sort of fundamental ethoses that sort of hold up all the work that we do at Citizen Zoo. One is that we put people at the heart of all our conservation projects. They're all community-led, and all of our projects would not be possible if they didn't have local people driving these projects forward, which we think is absolutely essential to our projects. And it's all about rewilding people. And we use the rewilding narrative. And rewilding means a lot of things to many people, but how we describe the word rewilding is trying to maximize the biodiversity that we have in a certain area, restoring our ecosystems to build functional ecological processes to have as healthy, most resilient systems as possible. And we try and be as pioneering. We try and be pioneering in that scope. So we do all sorts of projects, which include people rearing grasshoppers to encouraging people who are young carers to go and learn more about natural history, to give them a bit of respite. But what I'm talking about this evening is all about water voles and beavers. So if we were in a auditorium right now, I would suggest I'd ask people around the room to put their hands up to tell me how many of these people have actually seen a water vole. And yeah, because it's always a memorable account or a memorable thing when you do. But maybe in the question and answer, people can give me a bit of a nod if they've actually come across one, because it's certainly, as I say, a very memorable thing. But the first thing I would like to tell everyone is when Kenneth Graham wrote Wind in the Willows, he caused mass confusion because Ratty, which obviously the iconic character from Wind in the Willows, is not a rat. He is indeed a water vole. And I think what that really says, or what it tells us from sort of history, is there's two things. One, when he wrote the book over 100 years ago, water voles were ubiquitous on our waterways and a common sight on our rivers. And secondly, the place in which water voles were held and are revered in our culture. They're very much seen as creatures that which will enrich our daily lives and a really pleasant sort of species to have in our ecosystem. So I think that nod to them is a really important thing, and it sort of reflects our culture. But to give you a bit more background around the water vole, I'll explain the picture of a mammoth in a second. But their Latin name is Arvicola amphibius. They are a rodent, and they're one of 4 vole species that we have within the UK. The other 3 voles species that I'm sure you'll all probably know, we have the field vole or short-tailed vole, we have bank voles, we also have Orkney voles, which just found on the Orkney Islands. Really, there were sort of field voles that managed to make their way over there with Neolithic man and got stranded and became their own little species. But water voles are very much the species we're talking about this evening, and they are our largest by quite a long way. They're a lot bigger than all the other vole species. If you look at in the world context, there's 2 species of water voles that we have. One is the one that we have is our northern water vole, which stretches from Russia across to us, really, and then you also have the southern water vole, which is just found in southern Italy, really. And they've got a recorded history of about 28,000 years. They've probably been around here a lot longer than that. But the reason that mammoth is here, because at the time of the mammoth, we would have water voles everywhere. So they where there's not ice, that is, because they weren't doing very well with the ice. But the reason also I put that picture of the mammoth is because when water voles recolonized the UK, that was when the ice sheets were retracting, and which enabled them to live and dig and live in our watercourses and morphosorial, which we'll talk about in a second. But interestingly, we've got two types of water vole. They're all the same species, but they're sort of subspecies, and they came from two different recolonisation events. So if you look at the Scottish landscape, the water voles typically look black, and they're a species of water vole, that are subspecies that was typically found in Western Europe. And then a second colonisation event of water voles that you find in more Northern and Eastern Europe are the more brown-coloured ones that we find in the England context. So it's quite interesting to watch their sort of, look at their genetics and see how the water voles got here in the first place when those ice sheets were retracting. So there you can see a water vole. I'm sure nobody would try and argue with me that they are incredibly cute creatures. And as I said, they are our largest water vole. Males can get up to about 350 grams, which is a really important reason why we need them in our ecosystems, which we'll come on to in a second. They have the longest tail of any of our vole species. That sort of makes them relatively good swimmers. It helps them sort of use them. They always use it as a rudder as they swim around. And yeah, always a pleasure to see if you ever get a chance to see it. They have a very rounded shape. You see that chubby nape, that chubby cheeks, that front nose, and yeah, which gives it its cute appearance. But if you look at its eyes, they're very beady eyes, and those beady eyes are always on the lookout. You can see how they're always looking. They're always alert to the effects of the risk of predation, which sort of gives them a very nervous character. So it's actually very rare to see a water vole because they are so timid. And we can come on to that in a second as well, because it's quite an interesting behavioural trait that they have. Like all rodents, water voles have open-rooted teeth, and they can live for up to 3 years. But that means that is incredibly rare. All normal water voles will survive only a year, and actually a water vole population will normally suffer about 80% mortality rate in the winter when the conditions are harder, and in the spring and summer the populations rebound like we see in many rodents, and they can breed 8 times in one season with about five sort of little kits per litter. Where do they live? We typically associate with our rivers, our banks. They normally have a home range between 30 and 300 meters, which the males typically have larger home ranges than the females, but they are actually quite territorial. They will kill each other. They will live in sort of family groups, but the females can be pretty grumpy things. One thing to note about water voles, they are very good climbers as well. So when you're looking for water voles, also look up in the blackthorn trees and all sorts of things, because they can climb pretty well. An interesting thing to note about water voles, if you look across Europe, it's very occasional, very common for them not to live near water at all. And if you look at our Glasgow population that we have, they're a fossorial population, so they're diggers, and it means that they're effectively filling the niche of what rabbits fill. So one thing that we think that when the Romans brought over rabbits, we think the rabbits might have actually displaced water voles in the UK context and made them have to go live in our waterways. And if you look at water voles' physiology, they're not actually very well adapted to live in water. Apart from their good tail, their fur is not waterproof like a beaver or an otter, and they haven't got webbed feet. They can't hold their breath for very long. So actually, they're not very well adapted to live in water. So they could actually be our rabbits that are being kicked out of our niches. They've got incredibly varied diets. They can eat about 227 different species of plant. Willow herb and loosestrife are their favourite, and also the flowers of water crowfoot. They have to eat 80% of their body weight every day. And how water voles live, they have a 4-hour life cycle. So they spend 4 hours out on the river pretty much eating, and then they'll spend 4 hours in their complex burrows tidying things away. And they'll be pretty much doing that all the time. So yeah, pretty interesting. Another interesting thing about water voles, especially pregnant females, have also been known to eat fish, which so they are very sort of adaptable in their food types. But they have a really integral part to play in river ecologies. They're not a keystone species like a beaver is, that we'll come to talk to in a few minutes, but actually they have a very important role to play. The first thing, the most important thing, is because they are that big vole, that big sort of juicy meal for a heron with a kestrel. They do hold up. They are the foundations of a food web, and they bring energy to the sort of an ecology system to enable other things eat them, and that means that you can build more complex, more stable food webs on top of them. So when you haven't got them there, there's a big sort of part of the puzzle missing, because that food source is missing. And a heron would have to eat maybe three or four bank voles for every water vole. So by having their presence there, they increase the stability of our food webs. They also create habitat for various species. The reason I've got a picture of a grass snake here. Grass snakes love living in the banks of the burrows of water voles in the banks, and of course they are great swimmers and lovers of water. Grass snakes, and they're also very important seed dispersers, water voles, because they're eating 227 different types of plant. They're eating all the time. It means they're also pooing all the time, which means they are effectively managing the habitat on the riverside, but also helping to spread our seeds. The reason I say plop there is a really interesting behavioural trait, because so many things do eat water voles. They are very timid, and a really good way to work out if you've got water voles or not, by walking along the side of a river. If a water vole leaps into the river, it will make a really loud plop sound, and that's it trying to evade predation. But also it works as a warning signal to other voles that might be in the area. So it's a bit like an alarm system. So if you hear one plop, you certainly hear lots more plops after that. If you've got a good population of water voles, all these water voles are trying to flee predation. But yeah, it's quite an interesting behavioural trait. I think it should be one of the really recognised sounds of a natural ecosystem. And of course, they're also a joy to see. I'm not going to dwell on the law, but it's important to know that water voles are very protected, both killing them or destroying where they live. They're protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. One thing to know that only applies to wild water voles, not captive water voles. So if you're doing a reintroduction using captive water voles that have been bred in captivity, you actually don't need a license. Water voles are sadly the UK's fastest declining mammal. They have experienced probably a 98% loss in the last 30 years. There was a really important study done between the periods of 1989 and 1998 by a guy called Rob Strachan, who documented the severe loss, which was about 94% at that period. And that seems to be almost continuing. The Wildlife Trust have done a good survey between this 2006 and 2015 period, which indicated that decline was continuing. The two main reasons for that, one is habitat degradation and habitat loss, as we destroy and don't manage our river systems as well as we should. But the biggest issue is this chap here, which is American mink, which predates against water voles. As an American species, water voles aren't evolutionarily adapted to live alongside these guys, and these guys can get into the burrows of water voles and wipe them out.
Oh, this is so frustrating.
And wipe them out in one sort of fell swoop.
I've got it, but I haven't got any sound.
Oh, sorry, I can hear you there. Can you hear us?
Thank you.
Well, that's progress.
Could the person who's just joined put their mute on? That'd be all right.
Indeed.
Thank
Just to throw
you.
away or cast away.
Oh, no, definitely not through. Just pop it on that shelf there.
After it's one of these back.
Yeah.
That might be. There you go. No problem. Cool. So one thing to note, as they are the fastest declining mammal in the UK, we're living in a British system where many of our species are threatened with extinction. 1 in 4 of our mammals are, as indicated by the Red List, which came out a couple of years ago now. And I think this sentence here from Fiona Matthews is really, really interesting. It says, while we bemoan the demise of wildlife in other parts of the world, here in Britain, we're managing to send even our rodents towards extinction. And that shows you rodents should be everywhere. They've got a history in pretty much every river in the UK, apart from Ireland. And yeah, and the fact we haven't got them, that just shows you, these species that should be ubiquitous are not here. Just is a clear indication about the state of our wider ecological health. So the next couple of minutes, I'm just going to introduce you to a project that we've done on the Hogs Mill, which is in southwest London, and it's a very similar stream to that you have in on the Marden, as it is a chalk-fed stream. It rises in the chalk and then quickly turns into the clay. You may have all seen the Hogs Mill unbeknowingly, because if you've seen this picture, which is done by John Everard Millay, painted in 1851, 1852, the very famous picture of the pre-Raphaelite movement, he actually painted this the background here was actually painted on the Hogs Mill. It's a site that I see pretty much every day. And when he actually started doing this painting, he included a water vole in the original piece of artwork. But he took it to his pre-Raphaelite friends, and they said, "You've got to take out that rat. You've got to take out that rat." And he tried to argue that it was a water vole, but unfortunately had to remove the water vole from the picture. However, if you read his diaries during the time, he talks about all the water voles on the river. He talks about putting water voles in buckets so he could try and sketch them better. And if you take the original print out of this frame, all around the canvas are lots of little sketches of water voles. So it's pretty cute. So it's one of the most famous pictures, the most sold postcard in the Tate, apparently. But yeah, we've been talking to Tate quite a lot about trying to get the history of water voles in this picture. So it's nice to know that was our river. So water voles sadly went extinct on the Hogs Mill in 2017. We did lots of surveys and we thought, okay, how can we get them back? So what we did a big theatre. We rented out a local theatre. 800 people came along. And we launched the Get Involved project based on the work, or based on this. We used a lot of the work that's been done in the conservation world for water voles. So we've got this chap along. There's a chap called Derek Gow, who sort of pioneered conservation of water voles. He's bred about 30,000 of them in his time in Devon. And we also met this person called Elena, who actually works in the South Downs National Park, who ran the only ever community-led water vole reintroduction. So we had a lot of guidance from these guys, and we called our project Get Involved because, as I say, the community were at the heart of this project. So what did we do? So the first thing we did, we said we've got to try and survey our habitat to try and make sure it's good enough for water voles to work out if we can try and bring it back. Initially, I was going to try and do a really complicated survey based on the work of Rob Strachan, but we realised people who haven't got a real background in ecology might struggle. But when I met Elena in the South Downs National Park, she said, Elliot, it's dead easy. All you need to do is ask these 8 questions for both the left and the right bank, and that will give you a good indication if it's good for water voles or not. So we simplified the methodology, and then we trained 60 people a few years ago, and we went out and surveyed the whole of the river. And we then managed to sort of identify areas that were good, suitable. We gave them a green colour, and areas that are bad, red. We gave them we gave them that red colour to indicate they were bad. And then we worked with our local record centre and did a whole validation to ground truth our data. And this is what we came out with. So this is our river. It's about 9.9 kilometres in length in terms of the main body of the river, with these tributaries coming off it. And we identified this lovely patch of green here, which is about 2.5 kilometres of green. We said, okay, this would be almost a perfect reintroduction site for water voles. So what this did, it helped us recognise that we had the habitat that water voles needed. We also did lots of work around monitoring mink, making sure that mink weren't going to be a problem. And we have mink rafts, 10 mink rafts that are deployed for the last 2 years along the river that volunteers have checked on a weekly basis, even during lockdown. So it's a really great sort of community effort. So we've had over about 350 volunteers involved with the project, which is great. And now we actually teach our methodology. We created a little water vole survey handbook to enable communities to go out and try and do water vole surveys. So we're doing it in other rivers in London. We've also been doing it up in Norfolk. So yeah, if anybody wants to learn how to mobilise a community to do water vole conservation, we would love to talk to you more about that. But this is just a picture of our water voles. We've also done lots of habitat restoration, for example. We planted over 2,000 water vole plants. We raised £18,000 in a crowdfunder to enable us to buy our water voles. So it really was a fantastic team effort, community effort, which put us in the great position that just only 2 weeks ago, we were in a position to actually reintroduce water voles back to the river. So we had 101 water voles arrive just 2 weeks ago. This is them in their cages. When you handle water voles, you normally use Pringle tubes because they've got a nasty bite behind them, and they're sort of quite perfectly sized to fit in a Pringles tube. So you can see our lovely Jenny and Katie there from the Derek Gow consultancy showing off the lovely water voles that they bred for us. And this is our release day, where we put out these soft release pens, and these pens were put out for the water voles to acclimatise to the area and get used to it before they were then we put a little hole in the wall for them to leave, and that whole release period took about a week. And now we've got to that important step. It's by very much not, I've said the release day or the release week was very much almost the first part of our project. We now have the very important job of monitoring them into the future, and we're doing lots of interesting ways of doing that. But one, we're using little latrine rafts like this, where water voles will leave their nice green tic-tac shaped poos on for us to look at and look out for latrines. We're also deploying a network of camera traps that volunteers will check on a weekly basis. But more interestingly, we're deploying these things called bioacoustic sensors, which actually listen out for lots of different species. They're regularly being used for bats for about the last sort of 20 years or so, but now they're starting to be deployed for lots more different species. And there's now an algorithm for water voles. So we're going to try and strengthen that algorithm and use bioacoustics to monitor how they get on, while also improving the habitat that's there. And that post-release monitoring has all been funded by the Greater London Authority, which is very nice of them. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what water voles, the plight of water voles, and how we've managed to bring them back, and hopefully how we'll monitor them in the future. And now I'm going to quickly go on to a slightly larger rodent. I always think water voles are amazing. Water voles have been a big part of my life for the last sort of 6 years, but I definitely get more excited when I talk about beavers, because beavers are probably one of the most incredible species that we have in the world, I would say. They're truly a keystone species that change ecosystems pretty much on an unprecedented scale. So now I'm going to quickly talk about a project that we're doing in London to bring beavers back to London, and sort of give the rationale and justification for that. But again, like with water voles, I'm going to give you a quick crash course in beavers. So beavers are not the world's largest rodent. That title goes to the capybara of South America, but they are the second largest rodent in the world, and they're also the largest rodent that you find in Europe. We've had beavers on our planet for about 54 million years. At one time, we had about over 100 species of different types of beaver. Some beavers were taller than, well, about the size of a 6-foot man. So they were incredible. They had an incredible diversity of different types of species. But now there's just 2 species of beaver left. We've got Castor fiber, which is the European species that we find here. And you've got Castor americanus, which is the American beaver that you find out in North America and Canada. Again, as Kenneth Graham confused the world about water voles when he named water vole ratty, I think C.S. Lewis has done equal damage when he wrote about beavers in his Narnia books, when he wrote about the beavers eating fish, and that has caused mass confusion amongst even policymakers and general public and anglers for many years. But one thing to recognise: beavers do not eat fish. They are absolute herbivores. They love eating aquatic plants, grasses. Of course, they're well known for eating bark and twigs. So yeah, they pose, if anything, they actually improve the river for fish, and they won't be eating any of them. They live in very small family groups, and again, similar, well, they're even more territorial than water voles. You have a pair, and they will produce 2 or so kits every year. Those kits will stay with them for maybe 2 or 3 years before they get kicked out and get told to go and set up a new lodge. But they live in these small family groups, and if another beaver comes in to that territory, those beavers will try and kill that beaver. So they are pretty aggressive little things, or big things, I should say. Beavers do live for a relatively long time compared to in the rodent scheme of things. They can live up to 8 years. And unlike water voles, they are incredibly well adapted to live in an aquatic environment. They have really webbed teeth. They have waterproof fur. They can hold their breath for 15 minutes, where water vole can only hold their breath for less than a minute, really. So they really are incredibly well adapted to live in riverine systems. Probably their most important bit of equipment is these lovely flashy gnashes here. I mentioned that water voles had open-rooted teeth. I didn't explain what that meant. That means their teeth are always growing, always growing. So that means they're always having to sort of nibble away or grind their teeth to stop them getting out of hand. Beavers are the same as all rodents are, but what beavers, you can see by this orange collar here, that is an iron-rich protective enamel coating, which gives them incredibly strong teeth. And one thing, if you ever get the opportunity to sit next door to a beaver lodge, which is inhabited by beavers, just listen out, and you can sometimes hear them just grinding their teeth, just chiseling away as they're sort of grinding their teeth. And what that means, their teeth always stay incredibly sharp. It's like sharpening an axe, effectively, which makes them able to sort of, fell trees, and actually being the only species in the world that can sort of fell a tree in the way that a beaver does. Obviously, apart from humans with an axe. But yeah, my point here, they are incredibly well adapted to live in river ecosystems. And they're true ecosystem engineers. So the only other species that have these profound influences on ecosystems are probably humans and wolves. They really do have significant influences. And just before I sort of go into these, the reason beavers flood areas is because because I say they're incredibly well adapted to live in water. Their tail, if you see them, almost looks like you know, it looks like sort of alligator skin almost, and they're incredibly mobile underwater. They're incredibly good swimmers. They're not very good on land. So if you see them waddling around, their fat bodies, they can't run very fast, really. So when they're on land, they're always very fearful they might be eaten by a wolf, which they're sort of evolutionary in their barcode, the DNA barcode. They're scared of that predation pressure that wolves present. So the reason they flood areas, create these wetland environments, is to enable them to create an environment where they feel safer, they can move around. So they'll flood a woodland, they'll give them access to more vegetation that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access if they were running around and increasing their chance of being eaten. But that behavior, that sort of brings a whole incredible array of ecosystem services. And there is an absolute wealth of scientific research now that's been conducted in the European context, the Scottish context, and we're now redoing it again in the English context, because for some reason we don't believe what the European context might tell us, but even that has been well proven. But they provide incredible services to us. One is reduction of flood risk. They can decrease the impacts of flooding by about 60%. And that is because they increase the ability of rivers to store water. They create these sort of wetland environments to stop water just gushing through. They slow the flow down to create by damming it, and that therefore makes torrents less likely, and be able to improve the ability of the river system to actually hold water. Unlike humans who've gone and concreted it to make it speed up the water, which can bring devastating effects, beavers can really help to improve water retention. They can also help to improve water quality because they create a series of dams, and water quality is something that obviously is very much in the public eye at the moment. The series of dams in which they create, as the water passes through these dams, it effectively works like a filter. And one really easy and good way of showing you how effective that is, if you get a glass of water, you take it at the top of the river before the beaver dams, and it will look quite silted or quite polluted. Then you go down past as the water's gone through the beaver system, and then look at the glass of water by putting it in the river. You'll see that it's actually much clearer. But there's a lot more sort of robust scientific analysis that have demonstrated that. But yeah, we know they do a really good job there. They also help to improve carbon sequestration. And the way in which they do that, because they create a system which has way more plant life, way much more sort of biomass in it. And all that biomass is made of carbon. So it helps create ecosystems and improves that they can actually store more carbon. So they can effectively help us suck carbon out the air, which is obviously a really important thing we need to be doing. As well as reducing flood risk, they also prevent drought because they create these riverine systems that hold water more. That means water is more available when we're having these drought periods such as we experienced this year. And interestingly, the farmers that have currently embraced beavers didn't have the same issues with irrigating their crops as other farmers did, because they had access to that water source all year round. So incredibly important. So beavers are so important that actually, if you look at European legislation, the Water Frameworks Directive, they actually encourage beavers to be reintroduced and used as a tool for us to gain all these really important ecosystem services. One thing that I think is quite interesting, and many people don't really recognise, again, talking to Susan and Robert and Ian before coming to this call, I know that you've had a few records of or sightings of beaver in your local landscape in Bristol. But if you look across the UK right now, we've probably got about 1,000, if not more, free living beavers on our watercourses. These aren't beavers that are in enclosures. These are beavers that are actually free living at the moment. They're actually expanding, which is quite interesting. This is just a nice picture that I always like to show by the Ark for Nature Trust, and it just demonstrates the incredible biodiversity that and habitats that beavers can create. By creating these sort of pools, you get more refuges for fish to sort of bring up their young, because they've got more protection from predators. You get more dragonfly life, again great for grass snakes, great for amphibians, great for macrophytes. They are almost like biodiversity explosions. You put a beaver into the landscape and you'll have incredible benefits for a whole wealth of species. And we are now entering a period that I think is the era of the beaver for the UK. Europe have been way ahead of us in this context for a long time. Scotland have been way ahead of us, but we're now starting to see some real benefits in the English context when it comes to beavers. One thing to recognise is the range in which beavers had, and I'll just quickly show you this diagram. So beavers once were found across Europe, but if you go back about 400 years, they actually reduced to about 1,000 individuals across Europe. They were on the brink of extinction. So that's something to recognise. But they're now, and the reason they were hunted to extinction, there was a number of reasons really. One, because people wanted to hunt them for their fur, their really thick coats and hats that you can make out of them, but also a really important use for them at the time, or was thought to be an important use and definitely catalysed their extinction, was the castoreum. And castoreum is a hormone that beavers secrete through their anal gland. And because beavers are always eating willow, they absolutely love eating willow. Willow has a substance in it called saprosilic acid. That is sort of the active agent that you have in aspirin. So because beavers are eating the willow, they sort of almost create this sort of aspirin-like product, I suppose, that is secreted out their anal gland. So people would hunt them to try and access that to cure headaches and all sorts of things. So they're the two main drivers of their extinction. And as I say, they went extinct in the 16th century, about 400 years ago in the UK context. And at that time, they probably were down to about 1,000 beavers across Europe, which has really had a bottleneck for their genetics, which is an interesting thing to recognise. However, I say there has been really interesting developments in recent years. Many people might be aware of the River Otter, which was the first unauthorized release of beavers, but then DEFRA found it, came across it, and rather than taking the beavers off the river, they said, we'll study it, and those beavers were then allowed to stay there but once they realised and recognised the important benefits they bring. 1st of May in 2019, the Scottish government said beavers were then declared natural to the Scottish context. And what's really interesting, on the 1st of October this year, so in a few weeks' time, we hope that beavers will go from being what are currently a Schedule 9 species in English legislation, meaning they're deemed an invasive species despite them being here, but they'll actually turn into what we hope will be a protected species and recognise that they're native, which will hopefully be a really big step forward for our beavers in the English context. So really looking forward to that. And beaver reintroductions are now very much common within rural settings across the UK, which is good to see. So yeah, this map, as I showed you earlier, gives you sort of the European distribution of beavers. Some people ask why this little patch in Finland here is purple. The reason for that is they accidentally reintroduced American beavers by accident. So we have a population of American beavers living over there. But apart from that, we're seeing beavers have a mass comeback across Europe, which is absolutely fantastic. And we should really be embracing that as we want to improve our robust ecosystems and have more climate resilient, biodiverse landscapes. But how does this apply to an urban context? And I think it applies in many ways. The first thing to recognise is that beavers have a history. Obviously, I'm talking to you from London. Beavers have a history in London. They were here probably about 400, 500 years ago. We have rivers in London. One of them is called the Beverley Brook, which is named after the beavers that once lived there. So we know there was a recorded presence of here. We've got road names that are also named after them and all sorts. So we know they were here. But then if you look across the world, we know that beavers are found in urban landscapes across Europe, across North America. And this picture here is actually from the Olympic Village in Vancouver, in the heart of Vancouver. So a population of 3 million people, Vancouver, I think. And you can see here we've got a beaver lodge in the heart of an urbanized environment, and they get on just fine. School kids do school trips there in the morning. They're almost like celebrities, and local people enjoy seeing them in the main. And yeah, so it just shows that they can live in pretty urbanized environments. Also in Berlin, so northern Berlin, there's probably about a population of over 100 beavers. The police came out quite recently saying how they accept the beavers and they're a welcome part of the Berlin ecosystem and fauna. Again, across Bavaria, Munich's got beavers in the heart of Munich, and also in the Scottish context, Perth now has beavers living in the middle of Perth. So we know they are actually living in these urban environments, but it's not always an easy thing to live alongside an ecosystem engineer. You might have seen that picture from Berlin. That tree had a bit of a lump taken out of it. So if we were going to have beavers in the rural or the urban context, we'd need to manage them. And there's many ways in which we can do that. They're not actually that difficult to live alongside, to be perfectly honest with you. So, for example, beavers, we know they're very good at cutting down trees. We might not want them to cut down certain trees. We might be sentimentally attached to a tree, or there might be trees in high risk environments, for example, along a road. So if we wanted the beaver not to eat that tree, we can do two very simple things. One, we can put a cage around the base of the tree, and that will stop the beaver from going for it, because one, it doesn't want to break its teeth, which is most important sort of physiological sort of asset. So it won't want to break its teeth on the wire. So that tree is now saved from any sort of potential beaver incursion. And here you see a man painting a tree with a sandy paint, and that can also be used. Beavers don't like sand in their teeth, as similar to us. We don't like sand in our teeth from sandy sandwiches on the beach. So if you paint the base of trees with a sandy paint, that tree is then being saved from being eaten. So that's how we can stop them from eating various trees within our landscapes. Also, unlike water voles that are a highly fecund species that create lots of young, beavers don't. As I say, they have 2 to 4 kits a year. So they're not going to explode. They're not going to get out of control like koi poo did when they became an invasive species in especially the Norfolk area. So they haven't got the physiological ability to reproduce quickly, to expand their populations at great speeds. They're quite a long-lived species that have limited offspring. So that isn't a threat. But and also being big, large mammals, they are relatively easy to move around. So beavers love eating apples. So if you put some apples out in a cage, high chances are, if you've got a beaver that you don't want to be there, you put the cage out, put some apples in, and that beaver will come and find those apples, go into the cage, and then you can move it. There's also other things you can do. If beavers start creating dams in places that you don't want them to create dams, you can then quite easily remove the dam or just remove the beaver by trapping it. And also, if it's an area where, for whatever reason, the dam, you want to remain in location, but you don't want to have some of the impacts that they have, you can impart this thing called a beaver deceiver. And that is a pipe that goes underneath the dam, and then water keeps going along the system, and the beavers don't really understand why. But yeah, so it won't augment the river flow, or won't restrict the river flows. So there's lots of ways in which we can live alongside beavers, and lots of management techniques that we can apply to that. So what we're doing at Citizen Zoo, we've set up something called the London Beaver Working Group, and this is working with the Wildlife Trust, the Environment Agency, Natural England, lots of different organisations, the London Natural History Society, Thames Water, for example, lots of different stakeholders across the whole of London who might be interested in the beaver discussion. And the reason behind that discussion, a forum we've set up, is twofold. One is, how do we prepare for beavers to naturally recolonize our ecosystems? As I said, there's over 1,000 free living beavers in the UK right now. We have about 300 of them living in Kent, which isn't far away. We know they're also living in Oxfordshire, so on the Thames. So we're sure in the next 10 years, if not sooner, beavers will naturally make their way to the London part of the Thames. We want to be prepared for that scenario. We don't want to panic. So we want to make sure we're prepared for that eventuality and have a management plan in place when that happens. We don't want people just to panic and go out with their pitchforks. Also, we want to try and sort of be more proactive about it and identify areas in which we can reintroduce beavers in enclosed settings, just to demonstrate how we can live alongside beavers and get people prepared for that recolonisation event effectively, and also demonstrate all those amazing ecosystem services which we know they provide within an urban context. That's just the makeup of our working group. Basically, it's saying that we have a core group of organisations and a wider group of other organisations that are sort of interested but haven't got time, and then we have a public forum where people can talk about beavers. But this is a very important project that we're talking about. It's in Ealing, and we've identified a fantastic area. There's actually about a 10-hectare site. It's called Paradise Fields. We're working with Ealing Council, Ealing Wildlife Group, and lots of other sort of organisations. And we think this is one of the perfect places to reintroduce beavers in a very urban setting. To get there, you've got to park in McDonald's and walk underneath a rather grotty underpass. But as you walk onto that underpass and it's surrounded by buildings, you come into this amazing, huge conservation area. And it's got fantastic lagoons, full of willow, full of all sorts of amazing beaver habitat and structure. And we've identified it working with the Beaver Trust. This is Rasheen here from the Beaver Trust, who's a beaver expert, who's really written the book on beavers in the UK context. And we've identified this as a key area to demonstrate how we can live alongside beavers in London. This is an idea of the site. Basically, yellow here means highly suitable habitat. So this is quite a big site. You've got the Grand Union Canal here. But then all this modelling was done by Exeter University, who've been pioneering that sort of the Beaver Habitat Index, which is what we use to assess beaver quality. But this just demonstrates the quality of the habitat that we have at this site. But of course, beavers aren't just an ecological thing. They're also very much a social thing. We're living in a very highly densely populated area here. So over the course of the last year, we've been doing lots of community consultation events. Getting hundreds of people down, taking them on walks, taking schools out, doing all sorts of nature talks to try and get people excited about the beavers arriving in their locality. And amazingly, everyone seems most people seem really, really, really keen for it. We've launched a consultation, which has had over hundreds of people doing it. Some people have raised some concerns about beavers, but only from a welfare perspective. They want to make sure if beavers are here, they want to make sure that they are going to be okay. And the really interesting thing about this beaver enclosure that we're proposing is that people will be able to actually go into it. It's on a cycle path effectively. So people will have to be able to go in and out of this beaver enclosure. So that brings challenges, but also opportunities. And we're actually talking to Natural England and the Environment Agency at the moment, and hopefully in the next week or so, we should get our license signed off, which is really exciting. So I've whizzed through things there. Hopefully that all makes sense. One thing I would love to tell you all to do is after this, if you're not bored of water voles and beavers, go onto YouTube and Google a beaver eating cabbage. It's one of my favorite videos on the planet. And yeah, it'll always make you smile. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Elliot, thank you very, very much indeed. How could anybody ever get bored with water voles and beavers? One of the things I find fascinating about all of these talks, which have been fantastic, one is you're left feeling kind of rejoicing at positive news, but also slightly recoiling at the negative news. But I have to say, my kids get through so many tubes of Pringles. The fact that we found a new use for it, I think, is great news. And the fact that Millet's Ophelia should have been called Ophelia and the Rat is a whole new take on pre-Raphaelite art. So, Elliot, thank you very much indeed. We've got some questions in the chat, and if people want to ask a question, the easiest way of doing it is popping it in the chat, and therefore we can get through everybody's questions. What I would say is that Hazel Greenwood has told us that there are certainly water voles in the River Asker in Bridport, and they've been absolutely vital in terms of clearing vegetation, which sounds like a really positive thing. And she also tells us that there have been beavers in Dorset with the first kits born in over 400 years. So that's really, really positive. So thank you for that, Hazel. In terms of questions, I've got a question from Carrie, Elliot, which is, any idea if water voles are affected by the local rat population? But she says, great talk. But are rats a problem, Elliot, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and a lot of people ask it actually. So rats are quite a lot. A big rat is probably quite a lot bigger than a water vole, so they can outmuscle them, and they can have some competitive edge. However, one thing I'll always say: beavers and rats have coexisted for effectively hundreds of years. Water vole populations have only started to crash in the last 30 years, really, with the arrival of the American mink getting in our water courses. So, and previously we didn't see any real relationships negatively between rats and water voles. They will predate occasional ones, but they'll normally go for young or injured or ill water voles.
Thanks for that, Elliot. I've got a question from hang on, my screen just moved slightly. A question from Fiona Lunn, which is, how do migrating fish navigate beaver dams to return to spawning sites?
Yeah, they're really good. So a lot of discussion around this. So one thing that again is always raised is the evolutionary relationship between beavers and salmon. So we had salmon and beavers coexisting on our river systems for a very long period, and they were able to navigate very much in sort of our British context as well as the American context. Beaver dams, beaver dams are leaky, so they are permeable to fish. One thing to recognize, because beavers create these incredibly complex wetland ecosystems with a lot more complexity within them, there's a lot more ability for fish to spawn in sort of underwater vegetation or that structure to raise to sort of avoid predation risks, things like herons and stuff. So what we actually find, fish populations increase when we have beavers on a river system, and fish can navigate their dams pretty well.
Thanks, Elliot. I've got a question from Rob Williams. Are you able to share the water vole habitat survey? If you are, then perhaps you could either send it to Robert or to Susan, and we can share it if you're happy to do so. Yeah,
I'm sure we can do that. That's no problem.
Brilliant. Another one from Hazel, which is, I think, a really good question. What's the difference, given they're appearing in Scandinavia, between European and American beavers?
Okay, yeah, another good question. So actually, they're very difficult to tell apart. They look very similar. You would think, there's a discussion around it, but typically American beavers are slightly smaller than the European version, which is not the usual way it is, but when it comes to American things. But yeah, so normally they're a bit smaller. But the main reason where we can sort of differentiate them is when you look at their DNA and take blood samples and stuff, and you can see genetically they're two distinct species. They can't breed as well, so they can't produce hybrids or effective hybrids. So yeah, but from an actual ecosystem role, they're very similar.
And just, I know you touched on it in your presentation, but Olivia Bell, just a little bit more about how beavers can increase biodiversity. Okay,
yeah, so, well, it all comes down to creating environments in which biodiversity can thrive. So by creating these sort of wetland complex ecosystems that have structure both underwater and above water, you create conditions where amphibians can find more macrophytes, which we like water plants for them to seek refuge in. You find more dragonfly species because there's more because dragonflies are quite heavily they're quite voracious predators, and you create a system where you have more. You improve the base of the ecosystem, so there's more food availability for them. So a lot of all the research we see, dragonfly populations boom, amphibian populations boom, macrophyte populations boom. So yeah, we're just improving the environments in which all these different species can thrive. And then by having that base of the food web improved, also water voles are known to absolutely love beaver created environments. So you're basically creating a more stable food chain. And then on top of that, you get things like storks coming in, and you build a whole complex ecosystem on it. So it's all about the structure and complexity that they bring, and the water as well. But yeah, they're known as like a biodiversity bomb. You put them in, and the biodiversity will explode.
That sounds fantastic. David wants to know a bit more about the Beaver Habitat Index, and I think he's quite keen. I suspect we're quite keen to see if we can apply that survey to our river networks, Elliot. So
this was a really interesting methodology developed by Exeter University, and they've created this quite complex index, like a modelling system. I believe they have actually modelled the whole of the UK using that methodology, using sort of satellite imagery and stuff. I'm not good when it comes to modeling, so I can't tell you the exact sort of parameters in which they did it, but I'm hoping in the next, well, hopefully maybe even months, that data set will be freely available. So you'll be able to look at your river, your catchment, and you'll be able to apply their model to it, or already be applied, and then you'll be able to demonstrate its suitability. But things we're looking for are vegetation structure. Does it have the canopy, the species such as willow and aspen, which are important for beavers? Does it have flowing water? Beavers need flowing water to create to manipulate the landscape. Does it have relatively deep water? Beavers need water that's probably about 50 centimeters plus. So yeah, there's a whole lot of different attributes that go into that model, that matrix. But yeah, hopefully that'll be more available soon.
Thanks for that. The next question we've got is about mink, and of course their impact on water voles, and what can be done that's appropriate in relation to separate, if we can describe it as separating the mink from the water voles. What can we do about that, Elliot?
Yeah, I think one thing to first note about mink, it's not just water voles that suffer. Mink will predate all sorts of ground nesting birds. So if you have mink on a riverine ecosystem, it's clear, because you won't see the waterfowl. You won't see things like coots and moorhens, for example. You won't see them bringing up chicks and stuff. So they will be depleting the vast whole spectrum of biodiversity that should be there. However, there are improving techniques in which we can survey for them and control for them. So what we've done over the last 2 and a bit years, we've deployed what we call clay rafts, which are these floating rafts that have a clay base to them. And if anything walks over like the tunnel that's on top of the raft, they'll leave footprints, and volunteers have been checking that for the last 2 and a bit years. We also put out camera traps, and basically are surveying for them. If we come across them, we have a plan in which we effectively, there's 2 things we do. We contact the local wildlife centres and ask if anybody's willing to take in a captive mink and put it in captivity, which is a very difficult thing to do because they're Schedule 9 species, quite difficult to move around. Not people want mink, but we at least exhaust that as an option. And if that's not an option, we'll follow the Game and Conservation Wildlife Trust guidelines and trap it, and as humanely dispatch it as possible. But yeah, another thing we have these things called remote systems out on our river now. So either side of the release site for the water voles, we have a whole series of other rafts that actually have cages in the whole time. And if those cages trigger, I get a text message to my phone, and then I can go down and see what's been trapped. And if it's a water vole or something, I can let it out. And if it's a mink, I can act appropriately. But luckily we haven't had, in the last 2.5 years, we've had 1 mink presence, which is fine. But one thing we do recognise now, we've put hundreds of little sort of mink snacks on our river. Mink can travel about 25 kilometres just in one day, so they probably will show up here. So our monitoring is very much stepped up in to make sure that we make sure that's not a problem.
Thanks, Elliot. I've got a career question for you now from Oliver. He says, how do you get to where you are now? You're working with the Citizen Zoo, being part of conservation. This is a really good question, Oliver. Thank you. Any tips as well on how to get a conservation job? How do we get to do what you do, Elliot? Yeah,
well, it's a great question, Oliver. Yeah, I wish I had somebody telling me when I was younger about what to do. So my route has somewhat been a bit windy, I suppose. I started doing sort of human biology at university, but then quickly transferred to study. I've always had a passion in wildlife. It's only got stronger day by day. But so at school, I studied biology, did that at A-levels. And then after I finished my first degree, I went off and studied ecology at Edinburgh University, and then studied for a master's at Imperial and Conservation Science. So I spent quite a lot of time at university, but that's not for everybody. So the most important thing is getting out there and going and volunteering if you've got the opportunity to do so, and just learning about all the conservation projects that are happening close to you, and just learning while being out in nature. So and seeing all the other cool stuff that's going on. So just the most important thing is just putting yourself out there as much as you can, and just learning as much as you can, and hopefully then opportunities will unfold. I think as an industry, conservation is quite tainted. We're not very because it does depend on volunteering sometimes to get into it, it's not as inclusive as it should be. But things are slowly starting to improve. So we are starting to see more jobs come and more paid internships and stuff. So do keep your eyes peeled, because to my opinion, my biased opinion, probably one of the most important jobs on the planet is trying to save the planet. So we need more people doing this sort of ecological restoration stuff. So yeah, that's my tips.
Thanks, Elliot. And Oliver says that was really helpful. I think I'm sure it was for any of us wanting to get into your line of work, I guess. And the next question is from a good friend of mine, Robert McNaughton. Before he asks the question, can I just thank him for being part of organising this evening, and indeed organising and being part of organising all of this series of speeches and speakers and presentations, because they really are absolutely fantastic. So Robert, fire away.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And thanks, Elliot, to you. It's brilliant, totally brilliant. It's gobsmacking. On the River Marden, which is this river you don't quite know where it is in North Wiltshire, there are, sorry, I couldn't resist that. There are water voles, and down the River Avon, which is down a bit, we've got beaver. And my question is about otters. We also have otters in the river. We have breeding otters, and they're very important for other reasons that I won't get into now. Do otters eat water voles?
Good question. So again, similar to the rat question, otters and water voles have lived alongside each other for a very long time, you know, to little issue. The good thing about otters, they're pretty big. They're much bigger than mink. So otters cannot get into the burrows of water voles. The biggest problem with mink is that they can, and that's when they start eating them all. So because otters can't get in them, that means they don't have access to them when they're sort of hiding away. So the only time an otter would typically predate a water vole is if that water vole is super old or injured or ill, and then that's sort of selection pressure really. But one really positive thing, I suppose, with water voles and beavers, they both will need and have needed very much in the way of human conservation to improve their sort of outcomes in terms of getting their populations back on the river, whereas otters are doing a pretty good job on themselves. We're seeing lots of otters come back in lots of our rivers now, which are great. And there's some research, it's still quite contentious, but we think that if you have a good population of otters in a river, they might displace the mink, so it might even make our rivers better places.
Thanks. I could just ask a supplementary question. As I said earlier, we've discovered poo. You've got a different name for the poo of water voles. They're in the town. There's a certain area of the town which we want to protect and plant trees on in appropriate places. What else can we do to protect and enhance the water vole population in that area?
So this is going to sound, don't take this the wrong way, but one thing, water voles aren't great fans of trees.
Okay.
So what water voles like are quite open rivers that aren't heavily shaded, because when you have a river that gets lots of light, and then you get lots more macrophytes, sort of water vole vegetation, more food for them. So if you were going to do lots of planting of trees, I would suggest to do it in sort of segments, and you leave parts of the river that aren't overly shaded. But what else can you do? Well, one, make sure, well, I don't know how, hopefully your river's not overly cold voted with concrete. Obviously water voles they haven't got sort of diamond tipped teeth, so they can't burrow into concrete. So if there are elements of the river that need renaturalization, that would be a really positive thing to do to enable them to access the banks for borrowing potential. And one thing that we've done on our river, we've done lots and lots of planting of water vole plants. There's the water vole conservation handbook, which was last written in 2011, has some really good tips on what to plant and how to conserve a river. So I suggest you take, if you go to the library and get that book. But yeah, they're the main sort of tips I'd give.
Thanks, Celia. I don't quite know where the library is, but I'm sure I can find it on Google. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Elliot. I think I'm going to suggest that there might be one or two more questions that are yet to appear. I'm going to ask Susan Barker, who's the brilliant person that plays such an important role with Avon Needs Trees, and again is absolutely central to these evenings. Sue, you've got an event that you want to publicise, I think. And we'll just see if there are any more questions that come through while you're publicising your event.
Hi, Ian. Yes, thanks. And thank you so much, Elliot. I've been working with Elliot to organise this talk for, I think we've been emailing for a couple of years now, and it was worth the wait, honestly, absolutely fantastic. Yeah, I just wanted to take a little moment to plug a couple of things. One is our volunteer work days at the Hazelden Project near Cairn. We really need some help at the moment with assessing how our woodland trees that we've been planting over the past couple of years have survived the drought of this summer. We've done a lot of work with mulching the trees when they're planted and watering them, but we need to assess now how the woodland is developing and plan our further tree planting this winter. So if anyone's interested in signing up for one of the volunteer days that we have in September and October, we have weekday and weekend days. All the information is on our Avon Needs Trees website on our volunteering page. So if you'd like to get down and help with some of those, we'd love to see you. We have a new website. We're very proud of it. It's very shiny and hopefully nice and usable. So have a look at that. And while you're there, if you want to go to the events page, we have a Wellbeing Day coming up on Sunday, the 25th of September, starting at 2 o'clock and running to 5 o'clock. Anyone who has visited the Hazelden Project knows what a beautiful site it is, with the riverside meadow and the ancient woodland and the hillsides where we've planted the trees. And we always get feedback about how good it is for people's well-being, and so we just wanted to offer a day that's all about that. So John Chu, who is run a lot of our events and family days at the site, is doing a well-being day focusing on well-being outdoors in the natural world. So have a look at our events page for that, 2 o'clock on Sunday the 25th of September. And we will have another well-being day coming up in November. We're going to have some more family forest school days coming up over half term, and also a fungi walk, for anyone who's interested in that, on Sunday the 30th of October. Those have just been planned, so the details of those will be going up soon. So yeah, look out for all of that. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Susan. I think, Elliot, we've run out of questions. You've stunned us with your presentation and the detail. So there are literally no more questions other than the many questions that have already been asked. So if nobody else wants to ask, I'm still going to give a second or two for anybody that might want to ask a question. No, I think we're there. So Elliot, can I say again, as others have said, thank you very much indeed. You are part of an illustrious selection of presenters who have come and presented on a whole raft of topics over the past few months. Really appreciate you being with us this evening. Really fascinating, both fascinating topics. And I've absolutely no doubt, certainly me particularly, I've learned an awful lot this evening. I guess that's one, learning's key, and two, a call to action is the second important part. Lots of thank yous. Yvonne has learned lots. Hazel from Dorset, thank you very much. Anna Barnes, thank you very much. Oh, if there's time, I've got a question here from Anna. It says, ask, what type of planting is good for beavers? What do beavers enjoy? What should we be planting to encourage those pesky beavers?
Willow, aspen, they're probably their two favourite trees. They absolutely love aspen. So yeah, but they're pretty varied. So the good thing about beavers, they pretty much create the landscape they love to live in. So you can sort of let them get on with it. So there's not too much we actually need to do. They'll create the conditions that they want by being ecosystem engineers. But yeah, if you are going to plant anything, willow and aspen.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a fantastic sense. If they just leave them to get on with it, and they'll get on with it, and that's probably the best advice, I guess. So again, can I thank Elliot for joining us, for being such a fantastic presenter? Can I thank Susan and Robert from Avon Needs Trees and from the Friends of the Marden?